Welcome to TruPowur, home of the most powerful marketing tools, training, and technology on planet Earth. Get ready to earn, enjoy, and experience more than you ever dreamed was possible. If you're tired of just getting by and ready to really thrive, then buckle in and listen up. Here's your host, Matt Fox.
Hello and welcome this fine day. Today on TruPowur Academy, we are going to be looking at capacity tags and capacity and how that affects the PJM marketplace. And so today we have a special guest from one of our strategic partnerships with Smart Energy. They are one of our suppliers, and Matt Stasium is going to be delving into capacity and capacity tags in the PJM market so that you can understand how you can convey that message to your customers a little bit better. So without any further ado, take it away, Matt.
Great, appreciate it. I am Matt Stasium, Head of Strategic Partnerships and Sales here at Smartest. Hopefully, we can give you a little bit of background on we'll give a quick introduction on who Smartest is, just so you have an understanding if you haven't worked with us in the past, but then dive into the capacity markets and how it's ultimately affecting really our entire market in a little bit different way right now, and ultimately the end user and your clients. So hopefully to talk a little bit more about what we can do to kind of combat some of the recent changes, and then work there if there's any questions to help address those as you're out there in the marketplace. So that's a little bit of background on me. I'll let Chris give a quick introduction.
Sure. Again, my name is Chris. I've been here with Smartest now for about 4 years. Been in the energy space now for about 15 or 16, primarily all on the supplier side of things. And I enjoy the relationship and looking forward to growing and hopefully helping close more business.
Great, thanks, Chris. And actually, I appreciate you mentioning the kind of the time in the industry. I've actually been in this space going on about 20 years now. And the reason I mention that is not to say how long I've been doing this, but more so that it's a really unique time in our space with all the different changes, certainly in the marketplace, but capacity in general, and why that's become such an important part in the energy process. And really kind of a question for a lot of consumers out there that we're seeing, and certainly with the changes that we'll talk about as we go through this, and why it's become so important lately. So appreciate the background on that. All right, let's jump into this. So I'll do a quick overview of Smartest Energy, just so you have a little background on who we are. We are a people-centered energy company empowering businesses across the globe, and I'll get into that in a second about the global presence that we have. We really do utilize technology to help increase our effectiveness. We don't have a direct sales team, so what we do is we work with our partners to help them be empowered out in the marketplace. One thing I do want to mention, we are a subsidiary of Marubeni Corporation. They're a very large Japanese trading house, been around since 1858, number 190 in the global Fortune 500. The reason I mention that is we do have a deep financial backing from them and the resilience to be in the global marketplace as we see drastic transitions in the spaces in that as well. A little bit more on just the history and the international growth of that. So we started in the UK roughly about 20 years ago in a very similar fashion as we are here in the United States, as a generation aggregator that then can ultimately sell that retail. We work all through brokers and consultants in the UK as well. So about 20 years managing that model in a very similar fashion as it is here in the States, even though the markets are a little bit different. And then about 5 years ago, he moved here to the United States, and about 3.5 years ago in Australia. So a really global network, and we've seen a lot of different things through these markets. And certainly in the last 10 years, there's been quite a bit in the energy transition, as everyone's heard of. Our footprint here in the United States, as you can see here, we are active throughout PJM, which we'll talk pretty heavily about today. Also NISO and New England, and then ultimately we'll be moving into Texas as well. And we do have continuing expansion throughout the rest of North America as well. So you could even see us one day into Canada as well as Mexico. So really stateside presence here for all the deregulated markets on the electricity side. And just a little bit more, like I said, I'll get through this pretty quick and we'll get into kind of the meat of what we're hoping to talk about here today. But we are an electricity supplier, and as you can see throughout quite a few of the markets that are out there in the deregulated space, we do offer quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to kind of working outside of what your clients might see from either their local utility, maybe some standard, just kind of fully fixed products that might have been available out there. We do look to continue to push the market to be creative with the types of offerings out there. And we're going to get into that a little bit more and why I think it's important as we're seeing changes in the marketplace that could be either confusing, difficult, or maybe be outside of the typical parameters that clients have seen previously. So we'll get into kind of the flexibility about that. And at the very least, that the customers have optionality around their partners that they work with, because as we're seeing now, there's a lot of different components that are changing, and as that comes up, and the clients might be very comfortable with the product previously, you're going to allow them for flexibility. So as that education process changes with them, or their buying habits change, they have the flexibility with their provider to manage through that. Just like they do a lot of the other buying out there, I'm sure they probably have flexibility in those contracts as well. We do have a big drive for sustainability. While that is not our priority as a supplier, in the fact of it's not the only product we offer. We want to basically be positioned on renewable journey is for any client, and that goes across the globe. That looks very different for a client in the UK and Australia than it does here. I don't know if any of the listeners here would do anything overseas, but internationally there's a lot higher standard out there right now, or a lot stricter standards, if you will, for renewable products. In the UK, I think they're pushing for, I think it's 2030 or 2050 to be 100% renewable. In Australia, you can't even be a new supplier down there unless it's tied to renewable generation. That journey is very different here in the States. And the reason, again, why I mentioned that is we want to be positioned to support your clients in whatever that journey looks like for them, right? So if they have initiatives from overseas, or they're trying to meet some standard here in the United States, or maybe they just say, hey, we're going to be a front runner here in the States, we want to be positioned to help and support that, while also being able to, kind of consistently provide their brown power as well. And then the trade smarter, the reason we mention that on here is it really is important that the wholesale and origination side of a supplier's business is strong and capable, because that directly translates into the energy contract that a retail client can get from that supplier. And then the risk premiums and things that go along with that, is if the ability to know the market's going ahead of it, that it all comes through trading portfolios and kind of really minimizing the risk so that doesn't get passed on to consumers. So now getting into kind of what we were talking about here, and I'll level set this, pretty quickly, that it's an important topic, and the reason it's become an important topic recently is because of the change in cost. And that's usually when something comes up, when people kind of take notice and why it's happening. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on it. And for those of you who, I just don't know everyone on the call, so I want to make sure I just give a little bit of background on kind of what capacity is, and certainly in PJM. So really, I think the easiest way, and we can go through this scenario, kind of what it is here in terms of the timeline, but I think the easiest way to kind of define it, and I think someone told me this years ago, about what capacity is, it's really the grid's availability to have power at any given time on any peak day, right? So if every client ramps up to their max usages, and every generator has to run on top, that there's always enough power within the grid to support that, right? So this was designed because it had to get away from rolling brownouts, blackouts, things like that, grid instability. So the reason that the capacity mechanism was put in place is to really become this reserve of dollars to incentivize generation within a market to effectively be ready to perform on those peak days. And with that, there's a lot of nuance to it, because generation sources really can be difficult in determining which ones are the best for a particular market. Certainly as renewables have come online, and we'll talk a little bit why that's become so important in this scenario in a little bit. But what this was all designed to do is create reliability within the grid, which is very difficult because you've got changing demand, you got changing weather, you've got customers moving in and out of markets, and so that's why this capacity mechanism was put into place to incentivize generation to be in a market when the load may not be there every single day. So really a reserve, if you will, or dollars for those generators to be ready at any given time in the market. Now, the difference between energy and capacity, right? So energy, I think we've all been around it for a little bit here, where the energy is the true electrons that are powering a facility, right? So that's your generated a measure, right? Your kilowatt hours. And then your capacity is really defined as the demand side, so really in kilowatts or megawatts. And what that does is that, again, is predictive of about the amount, the peak amount of power or the demand that client can use. So the big thing about energy and certainly energy prices is it's not always about how much you use, but when you use it, right? So if you're using all your power during peak times, let's say middle of the day, middle of the summer, everyone's running their air conditioning, your facility runs full wide open at that time, it's a higher price than off peak times, than at night, in the winter, weekends, things like that, when the grid isn't at its highest demand. So that's where capacity really comes into play. The way capacity tags are set, so this is a portion that we can get into about, so every client has their peak demand that's set every year for them. And within the PJM territory that this is set, and why it's now become so important to the conversation we'll have here in a few minutes about capacity costs, is that throughout your peak times, and typically they're going to be in the summer, right? Because that's when historically there's been the most demand on the grid. And the way PJM sets their tags for every customer, basically saying, okay, on any given day, this customer might use the highest amount of power, that would be their tag value, right? And the way they set that is, rather than going out there and saying, okay, one day, one time, or 1 hour really, they go out there and set it across 5 different periods, right? And take the average of those 5 periods. Those are called the 5 coincident peaks, or 5 CP, as a lot of people call them. And what those are done is those are identified every summer. And so just to give you an example, I'd like to say 2 or 3 of those were in like June or July, and then a few more came into August. I think it was the latest one for this year. And what those are, it's a maximum amount of load on that day and how much your particular client uses in that day. And then it sets a tag value. It could be anywhere, 1 megawatt to 300,000 megawatts, right? Like it could be a very broad range of power or of a tag value. But what that does, it's unique for that particular client. And that then, the value of that, our tag, ICAP tag, cap tag, whatever you want to call it, that times the effective capacity rate that is set by the market and by the utility, which we'll also get into in a minute, or set by auctions, that rate times their tag times their usages gives you their capacity cost, right? So this is where I'm getting kind of into the technical side about the values of this, but this is where it gets very important for understanding how these values come together, and then it's how do the clients actually manage to that value, right? So that's where we're going to head in this conversation. So I know I'm throwing a little bit out there and getting into the weeds a little bit of it, but those effective costs have become much more important, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. But the interesting part about that is the capacity cost is one thing that the client is probably closest to in terms of managing, right? What I mean by that is if they can effectively change their 5 coincident peaks, or their 5 TP days every year, if they can manage those down the following year, they get a lower tag value, right? And so what does that mean to them? It ultimately relates to a lower capacity cost. And so that's what we're really trying to talk about here, is just starting to get to the understanding of how they can effectively manage to that. So now, why is it important, right? This is where, why is it important? Why are we talking about that now? So going back to what we were talking about of how the capacity prices are set, and this is the rate side of it. So we talked about the tags, that each customer gets their own tag. Now, what happens is the market then gets a rate that's set to, so it's your tag times your rate times your volumes, right? And so recently, as you can see here on this chart, every year different auctions come out, and what that is it's a buildup of the different generation sources, and they're saying they bid into it and say, okay, I can cover up to this amount of load, and my price is X for me to be available to run. So that builds up to a total blended auction price. And then from what we're seeing here is very, very recently, you can see down at the bottom of this chart that last year's tag or clearing price was $28.90. This year, it came out right following the auctions that happened in late July, came out to nearly 10 times that value, right? So it's a very, very drastic change. And if you look back historically, going back 10 years, we haven't even scratched $200 a megawatt, right? A megawatt day. I'm sorry, megawatt per megawatt month. And so with that, so what you can see is that 10 times increase has really shocked our system, shocked the system in terms of, hey, what can we do about it? We have customers that now have budget concerns because of it. We have a grid, and I'll talk to you why this number has come into the way it is. We have a grid that actually is showing that it possibly could have instability. And that's what these values are predicting to, is that this is what is actually going to take to create that certainty within load. And then the other part I do want to talk to you about here is that in this second column, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in the third column here, it talks about the amount of megawatts or the amount of load predicted for that next planning year in all of PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, out to Ohio and Illinois and things like that. So it talks about the amount of load. And what the crazy part is that has come drastically down over the last 10 years. But even with that, even with the drastic downturn in load, we're still seeing a highly elevated 10 times increase in the actual cost for what that capacity will take for these generation sources to be in line. So pretty substantial changes there. And that's why we are talking a bit about it here, and why, and I joked about it on a call earlier today, and why it's the absolute number one thing in every conversation that I have these days about energy, right? It is the pressing comment. It's how do we handle it? It's what should we be doing about it? And that's why I am grateful to Strip and the team for having us on this call, because that if you're not talking about it with your clients, somebody else might be, right? So it's very much something that you're going to be wanting addressing with them. And whether or not they take action on it, maybe, it may take them a little while to understand it, may take a little while, or maybe they say, hey, it's not a big enough change for me to make, change the way I'm buying. But at the very least, you're taking that proactive action to speak to them about it. So now, what does it mean, right? Or actually not really what does it mean, but why are we seeing these changes? So a lot of words on here. I'm not going to go through it all, but basically it talks about how these auctions are set, when they're set for why they change. But the reason what I want to get into is kind of the why we're seeing this. So the grid stability, like I mentioned, is the real core of why they do this. And going back to the point about, well, hey, how is the grid destabilizing if if our load is coming down? We've done a good job as a society to say, okay, we're going to use less megawatt hours, right? The greenest megawatt hour is the one not used. So, hey, we've done a good job to drop towards that. So why are we seeing this instability in the grid, or why are we seeing this difficulty in maintaining when we're down? All right, I'll go back to the chart, but maybe 5% of where we were, from 10 years ago. Well, the big piece of that is it's really what we're seeing right now is the renewable energy generation sources that are coming online. So we're going through this energy transition, both here and globally. But what that does is it changes the fuel mix that makes makes our generation sources available. And through PJM, primarily you were coal, you were nuclear, you were natural gas. A lot of fossil fuels burning in there. Heck, in some areas you had wood burning. You've had propane. You've had a lot of different sources in there. But the shift, and rightfully so, should be towards these renewable sources. So now that what happens with that, though, there's no longer funding that's going into your coal and nat gas and your standard or your old school fossil fuel plants. So what happens with that is, because there's no investment going into them, they actually get scheduled for retirement. It's cheaper to retire them, take them offline, than it would be to update the infrastructure for them too. The other part to that is there's the funding sources have now shifted. Let's say, hedge funds, investment funds, banking institutions, they shifted those dollars into the renewable sector. So it is very difficult to get to go to say, hey, I want to take my coal burning plant and I want to add another boiler to it, another generation source to it. The reason being is because it's kind of out of vogue to do that. Which again, rightfully so, we have some very high renewable goals that we want to hit as a globe, globally, but as well as regionally. But with that too, it creates that. So now you've got load coming offline, and now that's being offset by renewable sources. Well, the difficulty with renewable sources is that they're intermittent. We know, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Even with hydro, which has been around a long time as kind of a sustainable and renewable source, you might run into issues where drought conditions, or you no longer can you build new hydro because you can't flood out thousands of acres of a forest or anything like that too. So a lot of environmental concerns even around those. So what happens with that is the instability or the intermittency of renewable generation causes really instability in the grid, because you can't predict when that load is going to be online. Now, it's great that we're seeing more of that come online, but those typical the previous generation sources, you could have predictability with that. If you needed to run middle of the day, middle of the summer, you just bought more coal and you burned it, right? So you could predict on how that was, and really the only thing you had to be concerned about is your supply of the coal, the nat gas, the propane, whatever it is that you might be burning at the time. So that essentially destabilizes the grid a bit, and what that means is that it costs more to keep those predictable generation sources online. And so that's where the auction resorts are coming in and say, hey, in order for me to run and in order for me to continue these investments, it costs X amount of dollars. And so that's why we're seeing this 10 times increase. Now, the question then comes up, here, I'll actually jump to the next slide, but this is all the reasons why, that I was just mentioning: tightening supply, increased demand, environmental and regulatory concerns, delays in renewables, economic and inflation issues, just like all your clients are feeling in their day-to-day businesses. Generators and the grid feel the same thing. So there's a lot of concerns around that, even labor concerns to get these built. So what that means is that the pipeline of new facilities coming online for the last, call it 5 to 8 years, that has been very renewable heavy, right? That has been very much about wind farms, solar farms, methane capping. There's a lot of different options out there, but again, those are all pretty intermittent. And what happens with that is, though, they take a look at the forward market of there's always a pipeline of projects that are coming online. And through the auctions and things like that, they're taking a look at that of like, what is this supply that's coming online? How real is it that I'll come into it? And the bulk of it was renewable into that queue. So the difficulty now is say, hey, we've got this little gap, or we got a really pretty big gap in terms of meeting the demand. And how do we do that? Even if we started today, putting, reliable sources into the ground that weren't intermittent, right? And some, let's say it's nuclear would be, that's probably our most consistent base load, but very, very difficult to get sourced. There hasn't, I think it's since the late 80s or late 70s that the last one has been built. They've talked about small scale modular nuclear, all these different things. Very, very difficult to get sited. So that one's probably off the board for new generation. Same thing with the coal and some of the fossil fuel burning because of the environmental regulations on it. But what's happening with that now is some that were scheduled for retirement because of this demand crisis, those are being delayed for retirement. So they're just prolonging those, but it also takes more investment to keep them online. So when I talked about it was cheaper to retire them than it is to update them, some of those now have to be updated. So that costs, right? So they have to bid in at a higher value, and again, pushing our auction prices higher. So long story short, to get to this point, where is it going for the future? Is that we really don't see a big pullback in that, because even if you started building today on a more consistent approach on whether that generation is going to be, you're probably I'd say, I'm speculating here a little bit because I'm not in the construction of every day, but you're probably a 3 to 5 year minimum before these really start hitting the market as a true generation source, and the ability to drive some of that pricing out. The other piece to it is when I mentioned before, the amount of volume coming into the market is down from where it was 10 years ago, the amount of actual load. we are also now getting an increase in the prediction of where that load's coming online with, and everyone's heard of it, AI, data centers, all those high demand and high usage types of load are coming online. PJM, particularly Pennsylvania, Ohio, are very attractive for this load to come into. It's great for the economy, right? You're getting a lot of dollars that are flowing in it, but it's difficult for the energy grid. And the reason that it's difficult for the energy grid, it's a lot more volume that's coming on. These, in a very small, I forget what the amount of usage that a data center can use in a 1,000-foot square foot footprint. It's a lot, right? It's a massive amount compared to a typical industrial, even an industrial client. So a lot of that load's coming on. The interesting part is, typically supply and demand dynamics would say, oh, well, if the prices are going higher, maybe that load won't come on because they'll drive to another market where capacity might be cheaper, right? And say, well, okay, it'll balance itself out. Well, the interesting part with those data centers is they can actually ramp down on their 5 TP days down to next to 0. So capacity really doesn't become a factor for them because they have a 0 tag at that point. So while it's not gaming the system, that's what this system is designed to do. They will still be using power the rest of the time at a very high level, but they can drive their capacity costs very very far down. So I actually kind of put my hand in the air. I was like, well, maybe all the load doesn't materialize that we're talking about, down the road with data centers and things like that. But quite frankly, because they have the capability of ramping this down, and which we'll get into why it could be important for some of your customers, because they can drive a lot of that cost out. So as long as we're still in a true energy price environment that's relatively low, and historically it is right now compared to where it's been, and PJM still is a very good value for them from an energy perspective, and it's in markets where they can quickly connect and they've got load and infrastructure and people and labor and things like that they can do it. That load will likely still materialize here. So that was my one concern about a variable that might change, is that the predicted load might not be as high, but it does still sound like it's coming. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty hungry for the AI world as well. So I think everyone is, and I don't see that pulling back at any point too. So anyway, so that's the supply and demand issues that we're running into, and which is why we're seeing this kind of predictive spike. So here's how the auction dates work. Actually, let me see. I think we have a delay coming up on this one. Actually, this was pushed, and I apologize for not updating it on the slide. They are going to delay this one, but this is the way it works. So the auction dates happen for the following delivery year, which is also kind of unique to tags, because your tags are set the summer prior to when the tags go effective. So you got kind of this convergence of when things are set to when it actually happens. It's a difficult target for a client to manage, but as they start thinking about it now, if they have a long-term plan of where their energy prices are going, they can start to manage that now for the future. And the very least, as I mentioned from the start, is flexibility within the contract to take action on it when they can. So this goes back to what I was just commenting on the market outlook. Again, a lot of information on here. You can go back and read it at your leisure. Energy prices are, this is the top here is the calendar strips for energy prices, relatively low comparatively, kind of where it's been over the years. Still in a pretty good position, flat to down. This is the one I was talking about in terms of the stack. And so this is LNG exports, which drives the natural gas drives the power markets. But so we're going to have a little pressure on the generation sources. We actually, some of that nat gas supply that's powering that could actually be going overseas as well for liquefied natural gas exports. So, and then this again talks about coal retirements, how big of an impact that is. So there's a lot of dynamics that are driving to this, but that's why we want to try to give at least the background of it. Now, positioning yourself as an expert with your clients, right? That's probably where the rubber meets the road. That's probably why you've made it this long to hear me talking. And I apologize for that. So what does it mean to your clients, and right, how can they be affected to take action on it? So going back to the flexibility, if there are price reductions in that the capacity cost for the future, can they take action on it? So if your client fully fixes their capacity for the next three years, let's say, and there is any kind of pullback. We're not anticipating a big one, but could they then take action? Unfortunately, what happens is when we lock those in, we have to predict that for the future, right? So that's a locked in cost that we have to provide for, and it is a moving target. As you can see here, there was only a few people out there that predicted a near 800% increase in what that cost was going to be. So it is a hard and kind of hard to predict on where that is, but that just means there's risk premiums that get put into that to go ahead and fully fix that for a client. And so part of that would be to avoid those risk premiums, right? So how do they have a contract that has flexibility by avoiding what it would cost to say, kind of fully lock those in because they need that budget certainty, right? So if you have a customer that says, oh, no, I have to, know exactly what I'm going to be for the next 3 years, that's fine, but they just know that there could be premiums to do so with that, right? Depends on their load, depends on their previous history with tags, right? So we have to evaluate that. We have to understand, do they think they're going to have any changes in usages or energy consumption? And then predict that. And then so we're not as close to that as say the customer is. And so that we have to really, if you're talking about highs and lows, we have to kind of predict that at the high because, that's where the risk would lie. The next piece is it also incentivizes them to optimize their energy use, right? So if they're financially incentivized to try to hit to a lower tag value, those 5 TP days, because that will ultimately save them. And I'll get into a quick financial model on that in the next page. It's a very quick graphic on it. But they're incentivized now to use power in a better way. In a better way, and I think that's a very subjective way to put it, objective way to say. Everyone sees that as, what's the best way to optimize your energy and what's the best way to use it? Well, now they're going to reduce the peak, using it during peak business hours and maybe to some off-peak time, which may be difficult for some customers, but some maybe have never looked into it because there's no financial incentive to do so. And I say this every time I talk about this, that if on my washer and dryer, I had a ticker that showed me what the power prices were middle of the day, I guarantee I wouldn't be running that at noon on, 100-degree day in the summer, because that's the most expensive time to run it. I would set it for overnight. I would get up, I would do it right before bedtime, like all those kind of things, right? So there is optimal times to do that if the business allows for it, and it could shift to a dramatic difference in their price. And then the other part too is, as they're getting into maybe decoupling or looking at an energy contract a little differently, it also gives them the ability to hedge some of their energy costs as well, right? So it does allow them maybe to open the doors to some more, I wouldn't even call them complex, I would just say structured products, right? Some the ability to say, well, maybe don't buy all my power on a single day. Maybe I'll start breaking that out over a period of time leading up to when my contract starts and being fully covered or fully hedged or 100% fixed by the time you went to flow, right? So you don't always have to buy it the same day. That might be a little different from what some customers have done historically, and most customers have really just bought a single day, for a period of time for their contract. But I also go back to, likely there's not many other things that client's buying for within their business that they're doing it all in a single day. If you're an industrial customer and you're buying materials for smelting metals, right? You're not buying all those materials on a single day. You might average that out a period of time up until you're actually using them in your production line. So it's similar to how they may be buying some other things. Energy has always just been a little bit of a black box. So now I think what this particular change is doing in the market, it's just opening us up for some broader conversations about how they can actually manage their power. So might create a stickier relationship, might create a deeper conversation, and might create something that hey, I never thought of it that way. So I think these changes, while they can be difficult to take on early on, I think they can actually drive to some significant change in how customers procure their power. Now, so what does it all mean, right? Like, if they actually manage their tag value, right? If they actually managing it, what does that mean from a cost perspective? So this is a very, very simple schematic that we've put together. So if your typical customer is, say, 5,000 megawatt hours annually, they've got a tag value of 1 megawatt. Here's roughly their annual charges, right, for capacity. If they just lowered, let's say they were able to manage their 5 TP days, they managed their tag down to half. So they didn't shut down to zero. They didn't do all these things. they just managed it down by half. They had a significant change, over $50,000 into their capacity cost, and that's just by simply managing to those 5 TP days. Now, the question is, well, how do we do that, Matt? How do we get a customer to manage those 5 CP days? Well, there's a lot of services out there, us included. We send alerts to our clients, to our partners, that saying, and the way the 5 TP days are set is it's the peak load on the grid. So we know as the grid is ramping up to those days, we also have services that other service companies out there that provide these analytics as well, that is predicting based on weather patterns, based on storage levels of natural gas, based on generation that's not online in that period of time, based on the demand on the grid, based on what PJM is telling us for the next day's forecast, because everything's scheduled in the day before. So with all that, we're getting notification that we're then passing on to our partners that, hey, today might be one of those peak days. And typically it's between a set of hours. It might be between 3 and 7 p.m., right? So you might have a 4-hour window of when that's coming in. And so there's 5 of those set throughout the year. We might send out 8 to 12 alerts. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's probably about that. It's an imperfect science. No one's going to know the exact day until it actually happens. You might have load change. You might have a weather system that comes in. Something might come up. Something might come offline and actually spikes a day that we didn't know about leading into that. So it's a little bit of an imperfect science, but about 8 to 12 times throughout the year, these notifications will come out. And it's always during the summer months, right? That's really when these are being set. But if your client can take action on those and reduce by any amount, that will then reset their tag lower for the following plan. So granted, it's not an immediate change, right? So these will be set over the summer. The following June, that will go into effect. So it's about a year cycle, but it's getting them to take action to it. It's getting them to think about what goes on with it. The other part too is if they're working on any kind of energy efficiency programs, lighting, HVAC, there are a plethora of them, on-site generation, like those kind of things, right? There's a lot of things that they may be looking at in their energy story, is that at the end of the day, they should be able to, that should be decoupled so that they could truly manage to the tag. And even if they don't look to make these changes, maybe they say, hey, I can't ramp down. I got clients in here. I've got production I've got to do, whatever it may be. They can't ramp down on those peak days. At the very least, thinking about how to take action to just, utilizing power in a more conducive way, at least get them to start, moving in that direction of what could be possible. But you can see, and this is a decent sized customer. I won't call them super large. I won't call them super small. They're a decent sized customer. That's just significant savings just by trying to take some action to it. So we want to talk through what that means. And with understanding that these rates continue to go up, right? That's kind of the prediction right now, is that we're going to be in this elevated capacity cost environment for a couple years, right? When the first auction just happened, that was 10 times higher than the previous one. There was all kinds of speculation out there that, oh, no, this is going to pull back. It's going to go back down. We're probably in this environment for a good bit of time for all the factors that I talked about, that there just isn't a pipeline of new generation coming on. Demand is going to stay high. And at the end of the day, we're probably going to be in this elevated environment, barring anything crazy. Like I used to say, oh, nothing could ever change. And then, a global pandemic smacked us in the face one year and that changed, or, geopolitical things are certainly always the outlier with whatever happens, but that's kind of the environment of what we're seeing currently. Now, how does this affect you, and what can you do moving forward? Trying to choose the right product for your customer, talking to them about what that means, trying to educate them on these things. Work with partners like us. I know you guys have a lot of options out there, but how can we help improve and provide you the information that you need? If you have clients that are, into that kind of AI and data center, think through, is there something significant they should be doing with their load? Do you have smaller clients that should be starting to think about a more structured product and maybe just, kind of fix and forget that they've done in the past? Can they do more of a layered structure in their buying? Maybe, we've even seen this too, where maybe they fix energy now, pass through capacity, for a time being, and then once it becomes more known or more visible for those future years, start locking in then. Maybe you say, hey, I would like my customer to go out longer term. Energy's in the good spot for them. Maybe they're going to do a 3-year energy contract and then lock in capacity as they know that for the future too. So I think I'm just going back to where I started the conversation, is that just providing some flexibility and optionality around, kind of what that means to a client. So, and then finally, out of the box thinking, right? Like, I know we put on here that this is more so for like our partnerships, but like, out of the box calls, if we need a training call, if we want to get more into the weeds, I'm a regurgitated expert on what we do, but that's our real experts that if we ever needed to get them on on a call, we could certainly do so about how these work, or even in origination and renewable generation sources, things like that too. How creative can you get?
Fantastic information. Thank you again, Matt, for taking time out of your day to talk to us more about capacity and capacity tags in the PJM market. As you know, with TruPowur, we offer our customers through the TruPowur platform capacity tag notification. So be sure that you're educating your customers on that. And so, like always, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So have fun storming the castle. Bye now.